The flimsy plastic stick sat on the worn-out coffee table between them, a stark white accusation in the dim light of her tiny apartment. Damien Cross, a man who commanded boardrooms and brought markets to their knees with a single word, stared at the positive pregnancy test as if it were a bomb. His entire, meticulously controlled world was tilting on its axis, threatening to shatter into a million pieces. The woman across from him, the woman he had tossed out of his life with the cold efficiency of a corporate restructuring, met his furious gaze with a quiet, fragile strength that infuriated him even more. He had fired her to protect his empire, to guard his heart, but he didn't know that in doing so, he had set in motion a chain of events that would bind them together forever. He didn't know that the biggest risk he ever took wasn't in the stock market, but in underestimating the woman carrying his child. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The annual Cross Industries Foundation Gala was a universe of its own, a glittering cosmos of old money and new power, orbiting the gravitational center that was Damien Cross. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of billion-dollar deals, was Damien's natural habitat. He moved through it with the predatory grace of a panther, his presence a palpable force that parted crowds and silenced conversations. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, swept over the room with a practiced disinterest, cataloging, assessing, and dismissing. Then, they landed on Talia Quinn. She was standing near the sprawling ice sculpture of the Cross Industries logo, looking both entirely out of place and completely captivating. Unlike the other women who draped themselves in jewels and desperation, Talia wore a simple, elegant navy dress that clung to her curves with an understated confidence. She held a single glass of champagne, her knuckles white, her focus entirely on a conversation with a senior board member. Damien had seen her before, of course. She was a junior associate in his marketing department, bright, he'd heard, with a file full of innovative ideas that had, on more than one occasion, been poached by her superiors and presented as their own. He knew this because he made it his business to know everything. Tonight, however, he wasn't seeing a junior associate. He was seeing a woman whose quiet intensity cut through the noise of the gala like a lighthouse beam in a fog. Her auburn hair was pinned up, but a few rebellious tendrils had escaped to curl around her neck, and he felt an absurdly strong urge to tuck them back into place. He watched as the board member, a notorious windbag named Peterson, pontificated, and saw the flicker of sharp intelligence in Talia's eyes as she listened, her expression a perfect blend of professional courtesy and private analysis. Breaking from his own conversation with a curt nod, Damien began to move toward her. It was an instinctual pull, an impulse he hadn't felt in years, and one his logical mind immediately questioned. But for once, he ignored it. "Mr. Peterson." Damien's voice was a low, smooth baritone that cut cleanly through the older man's monologue. "I hope you're not boring Ms. Quinn with tales of the '87 market crash again." Peterson sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Mr. Cross, I was just mentoring." Damien's gaze shifted to Talia, and the corner of his mouth tilted in a ghost of a smile. "I'm sure you were, but I need to steal Ms. Quinn for a moment. We have a pressing matter to discuss regarding the Q4 marketing projections." It was a complete fabrication, but it was his company. He could create whatever pressing matter he wished. Talia's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise and something else curiosity in their warm, whiskey-colored depths. She gave Peterson a polite nod and allowed Damien to guide her by the elbow away from the throng and toward the relative privacy of a deserted balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air was a das. Welcome relief. Below them, the city sprawled out like a carpet of diamonds. "Thank you for the rescue," Talia said, her voice softer than he'd expected. He was about to explain his golf swing in excruciating detail. "Any fate worse than an E." "Death," Damien agreed. leaning against the marble balustrade. He turned to face her, the city lights framing him in a powerful silhouette. "I wasn't entirely untruthful, however. I read your proposal for the new clean energy campaign. One your department head, Mark, presented last week." Talia's professional mask slipped back into place, but he saw the tension in her shoulders. "Oh, yes, it was a team effort, was it?" Damien challenged softly. "Because it didn't read like a team effort. It read like the work of a single, brilliant mind, diluted by a committee of mediocrity. The core concept was yours, wasn't it?" She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. It was a dangerous game to claim credit over her boss, but the directness of his question demanded an honest answer. "The initial framework was mine, yes." "I thought so." He didn't say more, just held her gaze. The air between them crackled, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with marketing projections. He was standing closer than was professionally appropriate, close enough to see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, close enough to smell the prey. Subtle, clean scent of her skin. He had spent a decade building impenetrable walls around his personal life, but with every second that passed, Talia Quinn was dismantling them brick by brick. "You're wasted in your current position," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "I'm learning a lot," she countered, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're being stifled," he corrected. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the tendril of hair on her neck, and the touch was like an electric shock to them both. Talia's breath hitched. His own carefully constructed control began to fray. This was reckless. He had a strict, unbreachable rule against fraternization. It was a rule born from a past betrayal he never spoke of, a rule that had kept his life clean and uncomplicated. But looking at Talia, with her sharp mind and vulnerable eyes, complications suddenly seemed like the most tempting thing in the world. "This gala is a bore," he murmured, his thumb stroking the delicate skin just below her ear. "Leave with me." It wasn't a question. It was a command, but one laced with a raw, undisguised desire that made her shiver. Her mind screamed at her to run. This was her boss, her arrogant, ruthless, billionaire boss. This was career suicide, but her heart, which had been dormant for so long, was pounding a frantic, reckless rhythm against her ribs. In his stormy eyes, she saw a flicker of something she recognized in herself, a profound loneliness. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, she made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. "Okay," she whispered. The ride to his penthouse was a blur of silent tension. The air in the back of his chauffeured Maybach was thick with unspoken words and palpable anticipation. When they arrived, he led her into a private elevator that opened directly into his home. The apartment was a masterpiece of minimalist design, all glass, chrome, and stark white walls, with a breathtaking panoramic view of the city. It was magnificent, impressive, and as cold and empty as a museum after hours. It was the perfect reflection of the man who owned it, but the man who turned to her now was not cold. The fire he had kept banked all night was now raging in his eyes. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, his hands framing her face as his mouth came down on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was hungry, desperate, a release of pent-up frustration and a desire so potent it left them both breathless. It was a collision of 2 lonely souls who had found a fleeting, incandescent connection in the dark. That night, for the first time, Damien Cross's penthouse was filled with something other than silence. And for the first time, Talia Quinn felt truly seen, in the arms of the most powerful man she had ever met. She wasn't a junior associate or a cog in a machine. She was simply a woman, wanted and adored. She fell asleep wrapped in his embrace, lulled by the steady beat of his heart, a foolish, dangerous hope blooming in her chest. Talia awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a blissful, hazy moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The gala, the balcony, the searing kiss, the incredible night. A slow smile spread across her face as she turned, expecting to find Damien beside her. The space was empty. The sheets were cool. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She sat up, pulling the silk sheet up to cover herself. The silence of the vast apartment was unnerving. "Damien?" She called out, her voice small in the cavernous space. He emerged from a doorway she hadn't noticed before, already dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, a stark contrast to her own nakedness. The warm, passionate man from the night before was gone. In his place stood Damien Cross, CEO. His face was a cold, impenetrable mask. "You're awake," he stated, his tone flat. He didn't walk toward her. He remained by the door, a formidable distance between them. "There's coffee in the kitchen. My driver will be ready to take you wherever you need to go in 15 minutes. Talia stared at him, the hopeful smile sliding from her face. The coldness of his demeanor was like a physical blow. "Damien, what's wrong?" He picked an invisible piece of lint from his sleeve, a gesture of pure dismissal. "Last night was a mistake. A significant lapse in judgment on my part." Each word was a shard of ice, piercing her heart. "A mistake?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "It didn't feel like a mistake. Nevertheless, that's what it was," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers, devoid of any warmth. "I have a strict, non-negotiable policy regarding fraternization within my company. It exists for a reason: to prevent complications." The word complications hung in the air, and she knew with sickening certainty that he was referring to her. She was the complication. The hope that had bloomed in her chest withered and died, replaced by a cold, creeping humiliation. She had let herself believe she was special, that their connection was real. She had been a fool. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You invoke a company policy, and it's over?" "It was never a thing to be over," he said cruelly. "It was one night, and it's a night that must be forgotten." He checked his watch, a clear signal that this conversation, and by extension she, was an inconvenience in his schedule. "I've arranged for a severance package to be drawn up for you. A generous one. You'll be contacted by Eleanor Vance from HR later this morning to finalize the details of your termination." The blood drained from her face. "My termination? You're firing me?" "It's the only way to ensure a clean break," he said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Your presence at the company is no longer tenable. I'm sure you understand." But she didn't understand. She felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from feeling more alive than ever to being discarded like a piece of trash. The humiliation was so profound, it was suffocating. She wanted to scream, to rage, to throw something at his perfect, impassive face. But she was Talia Quinn. She had her pride. With as much dignity as she could muster, she slid out of the bed, keeping the sheet wrapped tightly around her. She didn't look at him as she gathered her dress and heels from the floor where they'd been dropped in the heat of the previous night. "You don't have to worry, Mr. Cross," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'll be out of your life. You'll never have to see your complication again." She dressed in the adjoining bathroom, her hands trembling so badly she could barely zip her dress. When she emerged, he was gone. On the table was a key card and a note with a single sterile sentence: "The driver is waiting downstairs." The ride home was a silent torment. The city that had looked so beautiful and full of promise from his balcony now seemed gray and hostile. Later that day, a courier delivered a box containing the contents of her desk. Tucked inside was a check with an obscene number of zeros, and a non-disclosure agreement that essentially erased her existence from Cross Industries. She signed it without reading it, her hand moving mechanically. The money felt dirty, like payment for services rendered. She tore up the check and threw it in the trash. She didn't want his blood money. She wanted the one thing he had made clear she could never have: his heart. Weeks bled into a miserable, foggy month. Talia's small apartment, once her cozy sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She spent her days listlessly scrolling through job boards and her nights staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that night with Damien, torturing herself with the memory of his touch and the brutality of his craft. Dismissal. The severance money she had initially refused was now a necessity she regretted destroying. Her savings were dwindling at an alarming rate. Her only lifeline was Chloe, her best friend since college. Chloe was the complete opposite of Talia: loud, impulsive, with a heart as big as her personality. She worked as a manager at a quirky downtown coffee shop and was fiercely, almost violently, protective of Talia. "You have to stop this," Chloe said one afternoon, barging into Talia's apartment with a bag of groceries and a determined look on her face. She took in the drawn curtains and the pile of takeout containers. "You can't let that corporate vampire suck the life out of you. He's not worth it." "I know," Talia mumbled, pulling a blanket tighter around herself. I feel so sick all the time." "It's called a heartbreak-induced funk," Chloe declared, unpacking the groceries. "The only cure is righteous anger and a gallon of ice cream. But you've been saying that for weeks, and you look pale. Are you sure you're not coming down with something?" Talia had been blaming the constant nausea and fatigue on stress and depression. But as Chloe spoke, a different, more terrifying possibility began to worm its way into her mind. She thought back. Her cycle was late, very late. A cold dread washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. "Chloe," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "When we were at the gala de champagne, you had one glass, and then you disappeared with Mr. Moneybags," Chloe finished. "Why?" We didn't use anything," Talia said, the words tasting like ash. "We were so caught up in the moment, I didn't even think." Chloe stopped what she was doing, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. She walked over to Talia and put a hand on her forehead. "Tal, no, it's probably just stress." But the seed of fear had been planted. An hour later, Chloe returned from the pharmacy, a small white box in her hand. She placed it on the table in front of Talia without a word. The two friends stared at the smiling woman on the packaging, their silence thick with unspoken terror. "You have to know," Chloe said gently. With trembling hands, Talia took the box into the bathroom. The 3 minutes she had to wait were the longest of her life. She paced the small space, her heart hammering against her ribs. She prayed for it to be negative, prayed for this whole nightmare to be over. Then she looked. 2 stark pink lines, unmistakable, undeniable. A strangled sob escaped her lips. Pregnant. She was pregnant with the child of a man who had fired her to avoid complications. She sank to the floor, the cold tile a shock against her skin, and wept. She cried for her lost job, for her shattered heart, and for the tiny, innocent life now growing inside her, a life that was inextricably linked to the man who had so ruthlessly cut her out of his. After the tears subsided, a strange calm settled over her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, pale, tear-streaked, but her eyes held a new flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her child. Damien Cross might have been able to erase her from his life, but he couldn't erase this. A fierce, primal wave of protectiveness washed over her. She would not go to him. She would not beg. He had made his choice. Now She would make hers. She would do this alone. This baby would be hers, and hers alone. It would be loved, cherished, and wanted everything she hadn't been to its father. The universe, however, had other plans. 2 months later, Talia was leaving the coffee shop where Chloe worked, a decaf latte in hand. Morning sickness had become her constant companion, and the city's summer heat made it 100 times worse. A wave of dizziness suddenly washed over her. The bustling sidewalk began to spin, the sounds of traffic fading into a dull roar. The world went black. She woke up to the beeping of machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic. A kind-faced nurse was checking her pulse. "Welcome back," the nurse said gently. "You gave us quite a scare. You fainted on the street. You're at St. Jude's Hospital." Panic seized her. "My baby! Is the baby okay?" "The doctor will be in to talk to you soon, but from what we can see on the initial scan, everything looks fine. You're dehydrated and need to take it easy," the nurse reassured her. "We tried to contact your emergency contact." "A Ms. Eleanor Vance at Cross Industries?" Talia's blood ran cold. In her haste to leave the company, she had never updated her emergency information. "No. That's an old contact. She's not—" But it was too late. The gears of corporate bureaucracy, once set in motion, were impossible to stop. In his 50th floor office, Damien Cross was in the middle of a hostile takeover negotiation. He was in his element, ruthless, precise, and 10 steps ahead of his opponents. His assistant, a hyper-efficient man named Arthur, entered the room and placed a tablet in front of him, his expression grim. On the screen was an internal email from HR, flagged as urgent. Subject: Former employee medical emergency. Talia Quinn. Damien's concentration shattered. He read the email, his eyes scanning the words. Fainted St. Jude's Hospital, dehydration. Preliminary tests indicate she is approximately 12 weeks pregnant. 12 weeks. The timeline clicked into place with the cold, hard certainty of a jail cell door slamming shut. The gala. The one night. His mind reeled. Disbelief warred with a sudden, white-hot rage. Pregnant. She was pregnant, and she hadn't told him. He felt a surge of betrayal so potent it almost choked him. He saw it all in an instant. A calculated, manipulative plot. A gold-digging scheme from the woman he had, for one foolish night, allowed himself to be vulnerable with. He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. The other men in the room fell silent, startled by the thunderous look on his face. "The deal is off," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "Get out." He didn't wait for them to leave. He stormed out of the room, barking orders at Arthur. "Get me the address for Talia Quinn. Now." The fury was a living thing inside him as his driver sped through the city streets. It was a shield protecting him from the other, more terrifying emotions churning beneath the surface. He was going to confront her. He was going to expose her scheme. He was going to take control of the situation, just as he always did. But as the car pulled up to a modest, slightly run-down apartment building, a flicker of doubt pierced his anger. This wasn't the home of a calculating gold digger. It was the home of someone who was struggling. He found her apartment and pounded on the door, his knuckles striking the wood with a force that made it shudder. When the door opened, he was met with the sight of her. She was paler and thinner than he remembered, but her chin was lifted in a gesture of defiance that only fueled his rage. Her eyes widened in shock and fear when she saw him. He pushed past her into the small, clean apartment, his expensive suit and towering presence seeming to suck all the air out of the room. He saw the coffee table, and on it, the damning evidence she had left out. The pregnancy test. "You have some nerve," he began, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with suppressed fury. "To hide this from me. To think you could play me for a fool." Talia flinched, but stood her ground, closing the door behind him. "I wasn't hiding it from you. My life is no longer your concern. You made that perfectly clear." "My child is my concern," he thundered, finally losing his control. He gestured wildly at the test on the table. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? What was your plan? Wait until the baby was born and then show up with a paternity lawyer and a bill for millions?" The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth, that it snapped Talia out of her fear. A fire ignited in her eyes, burning away the last of her tears. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low and shaking with a rage that matched his own. "You think this is about your money? I tore up your disgusting severance check. I wanted nothing from you then, and I want nothing from you now. Then, why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, stepping closer, cornering her. "Tell you what?" she shot back, her head held high. "That the complication you fired me to avoid had become a reality? Why would I? So you could throw more money at me and have me sign another NDA to make your problem disappear. This baby is not a problem, Damien. It's my child. And I was perfectly prepared to raise it on my own, without a single thing from you." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Herat, her fierce, proud expression, the protective hand that had unconsciously gone to her still flat stomach, and the foundation of his anger began to crumble. He saw no deceit in her eyes, no cunning scheme. He saw a woman who was terrified, hurt, and yet utterly resolute. She hadn't been planning to trap him. She had been planning to protect her child from him. The realization was staggering. His rage receded, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. He had been so wrong. He had let his own cynical demons and past betrayals color his perception of her. He had wounded her, fired her, accused her, all because he was a coward, terrified of the one genuine connection he had felt in a decade. His perspective shifted with dizzying speed. The anger at her supposed deception morphed into a cold, hard fury at himself. And beneath that, a new, unfamiliar emotion began to surface, a fierce, primal possessiveness. This was his child, his heir, and this was his woman, the woman he had foolishly let go. He had approached this all wrong. He was a businessman. It was time for a new strategy. "You won't be raising this child alone," he said, his voice no longer angry, but filled with a cold, unshakable authority. It was the voice he used when he was about to acquire a company. "That is not an option." Talia stared at him, bewildered by his sudden change in tone. "You don't get to decide that." "I do," he stated, his gaze intense. "This changes everything. We need to come to an arrangement, a contract." Talia recoiled as if he had slapped her. "A contract? For our child? Is that all this is to you? A business deal?" "It's the only way I know how to operate," he admitted, a flicker of something almost vulnerable in his eyes before it was gone. "I will provide for you. The best doctors, a new apartment, a safe place for you and the baby. I will cover every expense. In return, I will have full parental rights. I will be involved." The sheer arrogance of it left her speechless. He thought he could just swoop in with his billions and dictate the terms of her life, of their child's life. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "My child is not a clause in a contract. You can't buy your way into being a father. You have to earn it, and you haven't earned a thing." She pointed to the door. "Get out of my apartment." For the first time in his adult life, Damien Cross was dismissed. And as he stood on the other side of her closed door, the quiet click of the lock echoing in the hallway, he realized with a startling clarity that his money and power were useless here. To get what he wanted, his child, and the woman he now knew he couldn't live without, he would have to do the one thing he had always avoided. He would have to fight for it. Not with contracts and lawyers, but with something real. He would have to earn her trust. And he had no idea how to begin.